3 dump trucks rolled across my ranch before sunrise. The fourth one stopped just long enough for the driver to lean out the window, grin at me, and say, "You don't own this road, old man." The funny thing was I wasn't old, and the even funnier thing was I had the original deed sitting inside my kitchen, less than 30 feet away. They thought they were driving over public access, but what they were really doing was handing me the strongest case I'd ever built in my life, and by the time they realized it, they were already trapped by their own arrogance. My name is Nolan Mercer. I'm 43 years old, and for over 2 decades I've worked as a professional land surveyor across southern Nevada and northern Arizona, which means I make my living proving where facts end and excuses begin. Most people think surveying is just carrying around a tripod and looking through a little telescope, but the truth is you're reading history hidden in dirt, rocks, faded documents, and mistakes made by people 50 years ago. I bought my ranch in late 2019 because I wanted quiet after years of chasing property disputes for other people. 200 acres of dry land isn't exactly paradise to most folks, but to me, it was peace. There were old mining trails, abandoned equipment, scattered mesquite trees, and enough open sky to remind me every evening that the world is bigger than whatever problem happens to be sitting in front of you. The first year was exactly what I hoped for. I repaired fences, cleaned debris, restored an old barn, and even joked with my neighbor Frank that the loudest thing on my property was my coffee maker every morning. Frank laughed and said, "Give it time, somebody always finds a way to ruin silence." Turns out he was a prophet. Around early March, I noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across my private access road. At first, I figured a hunter got lost, or maybe someone from the utility company made a wrong turn. It happens. I brushed it off because not every problem deserves a fight. Then the tracks got wider, deeper, and heavier until one afternoon I watched a fully loaded gravel truck bounce across my road, throwing dust over my fence line like a sandstorm. Before I could even wave it down, another truck followed behind it, then another. The ground shook so hard my toolbox rattled inside the garage. I drove my pickup over and flagged down the last driver. "Hey, where are you headed?" I asked. He shrugged like he was ordering lunch. "Same place we've been going all week." "You're on private property." He looked at me for 2 seconds before pointing somewhere beyond the hills. "Boss says this is county access." Then he rolled his window up and kept driving. That sentence stayed with me all night because I knew it wasn't true. I had surveyed every inch of that land myself before signing the closing papers. I knew where every marker sat, every corner monument, every old mining easement that still existed, and every one that had expired decades ago. Still, I didn't want to become the angry guy screaming at construction workers doing what they were told. So instead of arguing, I started watching. I checked my cameras every evening. The trucks came at nearly the same hours every day, sometimes 5 trips, sometimes 8. They left ruts deep enough to twist an ankle and coated everything with dust, including the vegetable garden my wife, Emily, had spent 2 years building. One afternoon, she walked into the house, carrying tomatoes covered in gray powder, and simply asked, "How long are you going to let this happen?" She wasn't yelling. Somehow that made it worse. The next morning, I parked beside the road with a folding chair, a notebook, and a thermos of coffee. Around 8:30, a shiny black pickup appeared leading another convoy. The driver couldn't have been older than 28. Expensive sunglasses, spotless boots, brand new truck, the kind of confidence you only get when you've never been told no. He slowed beside me and smiled. "Need something?" I answered. "Actually, I was going to ask you the same question." He laughed. "We're working a county contract. Across my land?" "That's what we were told." "Who told you?" He leaned back and grinned even wider. "People that matter." Then he tipped 2 fingers against his hat and drove away while the trucks followed him like ducklings behind their mother. I sat there another minute staring at the dust cloud and realized something that years in surveying had taught me better than anything else. Honest mistakes disappear when evidence appears. Arrogant people double down. So instead of chasing those trucks, I walked into my office, unlocked the fireproof cabinet holding every closing document for my ranch purchase, spread the maps across the table, and whispered to myself, "All right, let's find out exactly who thinks they own my road." The engineering catalog stayed open on my desk until well after midnight, But the truth was I wasn't looking at the picture anymore. I was looking through it, imagining every truck that had bounced across my road coming to a complete stop in front of a line of steel they couldn't argue with. Emily walked into the office carrying 2 mugs of coffee, set one beside me, and quietly asked, "You're thinking about those barriers again, aren't you?" I smiled without taking my eyes off the paperwork. "I'm thinking about boundaries." She pulled out the chair across from me and looked at the maps scattered over the table. "You know, when we bought this place, I thought the biggest problem we have would be coyotes getting into the chicken coop." I laughed. Turns out the coyotes drive diesel trucks now. For a second, we both laughed, but the silence that followed carried a different weight because neither of us liked conflict. We bought this ranch to escape noise, politics, and people constantly stepping on each other. Yet somehow all three had followed us into the desert. The next morning, I drove into the county records office with a folder nearly 3 inches thick. Some people think confidence comes from speaking loudly, but after 20 years working property disputes, I'd learned confidence comes from walking into a room already knowing what every document inside your folder says. Martha, the elderly records clerk, recognized me before I reached the counter. "Back again?" she asked with a grin. "Either I'm getting old or your neighbors are getting creative." I slid the folder toward her and said, "Can you pull every archived map connected to parcel 18B going back as far as you've got?" She disappeared into the back room and returned nearly half an hour later, carrying a stack of faded survey sheets tied together with string. Some of them looked older than my father. We spread them across a large table, comparing handwritten measurements to modern digital records, tracing lines that had been established generations before either of us was born. Finally, she adjusted her glasses, pointed at the access road with a pencil, and said, "There it is. The temporary mining easement expired decades ago. It was never renewed, never transferred, and never converted into public access." I looked at her and asked, "So if someone says this is a county road?" She chuckled. "Then someone either doesn't know what they're talking about or hopes you don't." Driving home, I realized something important. I no longer needed to prove I owned the road to myself. I needed to prove that they knew I owned it and chose to ignore it anyway. That's a very different legal argument. Instead of confronting another truck driver, I called my old college friend Dennis, an engineer who specialized in industrial monitoring systems. He showed up 2 days later, towing a trailer full of equipment that looked more suited for a military checkpoint than a ranch road. He climbed out wearing sunglasses and said, "Please tell me we're building something ridiculous." I pointed toward the road where another convoy was kicking dust into the air. "No, we're documenting something ridiculous." For the next 48 hours, we worked from sunrise until after dark installing concealed load sensors beneath the road surface, synchronizing cameras with atomic clock timing, and testing software that could estimate axle weights within an incredibly small margin of error. Dennis looked at the monitor after the first successful test and whistled. "Every truck that crosses this road is basically signing its own confession." I smiled. "That's the idea." Emily brought sandwiches outside and sat on the tailgate while we watched the system record another passing truck. She asked, "Do they have any idea?" Dennis laughed. "If they did, they'd be driving somewhere else." Within the first week, the numbers became almost unbelievable. Trip after trip appeared on the screen with precise timestamps and estimated loads. Some mornings there were 4 trucks. Other mornings there were 7. The road, which had once carried nothing heavier than my pickup and an occasional tractor, now vibrated like a freight terminal. The gravel surface deteriorated faster every day, drainage ditches collapsed under the repeated weight, and dust settled over fences, equipment, and Emily's vegetable garden until everything looked faded. One evening she stood outside wiping dirt off a row of tomatoes and quietly said, "I know this sounds silly, but I miss hearing birds." I looked around and realized she was right. The constant engine noise had driven them away. That bothered me more than the ruts in the road. A few days later, I decided to visit the construction site itself. Their temporary office sat beside towering piles of aggregate with loaders moving back and forth like giant insects. Inside, a receptionist asked if I had an appointment. "No," I answered, "but I believe your company has been using my property for free." That sentence got me into the manager's office surprisingly fast. The project's supervisor introduced himself as Victor Hale, a polished man with pressed jeans, expensive boots, and the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to getting cooperation instead of resistance. He shook my hand and gestured toward a chair. "Let's solve whatever misunderstanding brought you here." I sat down, but didn't remove the folder from under my arm. "There isn't a misunderstanding. Your trucks are crossing private property without permission." He leaned back. "Our operations team believes that route serves public access." I slid a copy of my survey across his desk. He glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds before pushing it back. "I'm sure your paperwork is impressive. It's legally recorded. Our information says otherwise." "Then show me your information." He smiled but didn't answer. Instead, he folded his hands and said, "Mr. Mercer, these projects create jobs. Sometimes communities have to work together." I nodded. "Communities work together. Trespassers don't." His smile disappeared. "Are you threatening to stop construction?" "No. Irrevocably. I'm informing you that you're already creating evidence." He stood, signaling the meeting was over. "I'll have legal review everything." I stood too and answered, "Please do. They're going to enjoy the reading." Outside, I sat in my truck for several minutes thinking about the conversation. At no point had he produced a map, a permit, or a deed. He relied entirely on confidence. That's when I realized arrogance is often just insecurity wearing expensive boots. Back at the ranch, I organized the growing mountain of evidence into binders labeled by date. Emily walked in carrying dinner and laughed. "This doesn't look like a dining room anymore." "No," I said, stacking another folder. "It looks like a courtroom waiting for a judge." She sat beside me, flipping through photographs of trucks entering the property. "Do you ever wonder if we're making too much of this?" I looked at the latest sensor report showing another overloaded convoy. "Every time. Then they come back the next morning." She nodded slowly because she understood. The issue was never just the road. It was the assumption that because someone had influence, deadlines, and political connections, our rights were negotiable. The following Monday, I mailed a certified demand letter giving the company one final opportunity to stop using the road or negotiate a commercial access agreement. My attorney reviewed every line before it went out and called me afterward. "Nolan," he said, "if they ignore this letter, they're making a decision they'll regret." 4 days later, the response arrived. 3 paragraphs. No evidence. No survey. No legal citations. Just a claim that they believe the road was available for public use and intended to continue operations. I read it twice before handing it to Frank, who had stopped by with barbecue for the weekend. He read the letter, looked toward the road where another truck thundered past, and laughed so hard he nearly dropped his plate. "I've seen people bluff at a poker table," he said, "but I've never seen anyone bluff against recorded property records." I folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and looked through the window toward the entrance of the ranch where tire tracks cut deeper into the earth every single day. The frustration I'd carried for weeks was gone, replaced by something quieter and far more dangerous. I wasn't wondering anymore whether I could stop them. I was simply deciding the exact morning they would discover that a private road stays private only until its owner finally decides to enforce the word no. The engineering catalog stayed open on my desk long after the sun went down, and I must have stared at the same page for 20 minutes because Emily finally walked into the office, leaned against the doorframe, and asked, "You're not planning something illegal, are you?" I looked up and laughed. "No, I'm planning something completely legal, which is probably going to annoy them even more." She walked over, looked at the picture of the industrial hydraulic bollards, and raised an eyebrow. "Those things look like they belong outside a federal building." "Exactly," I said. "They're designed to stop vehicles, not arguments." She smiled, kissed me on the forehead, and before leaving the room, she said something that stuck with me. "Then make sure you win the right way." That's the thing people don't understand about property disputes. Movies make them look like screaming matches with shotguns and angry neighbors. Real life is slower. Real life is paperwork, patience, and waiting for the other side to convince themselves they're untouchable. Over the next week, I kept collecting data while the trucks kept rolling across my road as if my certified letter had never existed. Every morning around 7:30, the convoy appeared almost like clockwork. The lead pickup would come first, then 2 loaded dump trucks, sometimes 3, occasionally 5 if they were trying to catch up on schedule. The sensors buried beneath the road quietly logged axle weights, while my cameras recorded every plate and every timestamp. Dennis stopped by to check the equipment and looked over the numbers. He whistled. "They're not just using your road. They're depending on it." I nodded, which means if this road disappears from their plans, their schedule falls apart. He folded his arms. Then why haven't they called to negotiate? I looked out the window at another truck disappearing over the hill. Because somebody convinced them they don't have to. A few days later, I drove into town for supplies and happened to run into an old acquaintance named Carl Benson, a retired highway inspector who seemed to know everyone in 3 counties. After we talked for a while, he lowered his voice and asked, "You're the fellow having trouble with Black Ridge, right?" I nodded. He glanced around before saying, "Word is the field operations are being run by a young guy named Logan Pierce. His uncle works in law enforcement, and the kid walks around acting like permits are suggestions." I didn't answer right away. I simply thanked him and finished loading my truck, but the conversation explained the confidence I'd been seeing from day one. It wasn't that they had evidence. They had connections, or at least they believed they did. Back home, I reviewed another week of footage and noticed something that made me sit up in my chair. The lead pickup slowed at the entrance almost every morning, not because the driver was checking traffic, but because he waved directly toward my security camera. It wasn't an accident. It was a performance. He wanted me to know they weren't afraid of me. Emily watched the clip beside me and shook her head. "He's trying to get under your skin." I smiled. "Then let's disappoint him." The following Monday, I mailed one final certified notice, this time attaching photographs, survey references, and a clear demand that all commercial traffic stop immediately unless a written agreement was reached. My attorney called after reviewing the package and said, "Nolan, once this goes out, you've established that they were formally notified. If they keep using the road, they're making a choice." "Good," I replied. "I want every decision from this point forward to belong to them." 3 days later, the response arrived, and it somehow managed to be even shorter than the first one. They maintained that they had the right to use the route and intended to continue operations. No documents, no explanation, just another assumption wrapped in expensive legal stationery. Frank came over that evening carrying burgers for the grill, and after reading the letter, he laughed so hard he had to sit down. "I've seen people bluff at poker," he said, "but I've never seen anyone bluff against county records." I laughed too, but inside I realized something important. They weren't trying to prove they were right anymore. They were betting I would get tired before they got caught. They didn't know me very well. The next morning, I signed a purchase order for 10 heavy-duty hydraulic bollards rated to stop commercial vehicles. The supplier called to confirm the order and asked, "These are usually installed at military facilities or distribution centers. Are you sure this is what you need?" I answered, "I own a private road that's been mistaken for a public highway." He paused for a second and then said, "Well, that'll do it." Installation was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I told almost no one except Emily and Dennis, because surprises work best when only one side knows they're coming. During those final days before installation, the trucks continued their routine while I continued mine, recording, documenting, waiting. The young manager slowed beside me again one morning and leaned out the window. "Still writing everything down?" he called. "Every single trip," I answered. He laughed. "You're wasting your time." I smiled back and replied, "Maybe, but I've learned something over the years. The difference between history and evidence is that evidence comes with timestamps." He shook his head, accelerated, and disappeared into another cloud of dust, completely unaware that the road he considered guaranteed access was only days away from changing forever. Sitting on my porch that evening with the desert wind finally settling down, I looked toward the entrance of the ranch where the installation crew would arrive at sunrise and realized I wasn't preparing for a confrontation anymore. I was preparing for a boundary, and once a boundary is enforced, people who have been borrowing your rights suddenly discover how expensive assumptions can become.